everyone. Welcome to today's webinar for benefits of a project to product transformation and how to get started. My name is Rachel Abrams. I'm going to go over a few quick logistics and then I will pass it over to Mark Story and Randy Hale. So just a reminder, this session is being recorded. We will send out the webinar recording in the next few days to the email address that you registered for this webinar with. This is a Zoom webinar, so you are muted and we cannot see you. If you have any logistical questions, you can talk to me through the chat and I will help resolve those. Any questions that you have about the presentation, please use the Q&A panel to submit those questions anytime throughout the talk. Mark and Randy will answer those as they kind of flow naturally through the presentation or in our dedicated Q&A section at the end. And now I will pass it over to Agile Transformation Coaches Mark Story and Randy Hale.
Okay, hi everybody. I am Mark Story, one of the coaches here, and then Randy Hale, and a partner on this. We're going to run this through you. So we're going to start out and tell you some stuff that you probably already know, which is why you might want to change and consider a different model. And so this little graph here shows you kind of the amount of change and the acceleration of that change. This is a simple way of looking at it in terms of how long companies have managed to stay in the S&P 500. And you can see we went back to 1965, 33 years. And by 2026, the trend says that companies are going to be able to maintain that leadership position for less than half of that time. So you can see that there's a lot of things going on here that are driving pretty dramatic changes in the way we all do business. A lot of that has to do with the rate of disruption. That has to do with technology, information available everywhere all the time, globalization, hyper competition, a lot of it from places you might not expect, customer expectations that are very different and very rapidly evolving from what we might be accustomed to, and then the complexity of offering a product to the market. So we've got lots and lots of things here that are really driving change in very dramatic ways. So in light of all these changes, there are some pretty fundamental things that haven't changed. So we've got things like the way leadership thinks about things, management practices, organizational structures, financial planning and tracking. These things are really, they're still back in things that were invented early in the 20th century. And in a lot of cases, that has led to some serious problems for a lot of companies who are market leaders. You can just keep going, Randy. I've got no real. And so for a lot of companies, that has turned out to look something like this. Just keep on going through this, Randy. And so a lot of you are probably very familiar with many of the names on here, companies that had at one point absolutely dominant market positions. And in many cases, these companies still exist, but they're not really relevant as a significant competitor, or they are gone altogether. And there's no single cause to it other than to say that disruption that we were talking about earlier really kind of drove this, but you can kind of boil it down to a couple of things. One is failure to recognize the change and to innovate around that change, and failure to execute. So that's what we want to talk about here. Is we want to talk about how we can get you to the top and keep you to the top through thinking about things a little bit differently. Keep on going, Randy. And so Mick Kirsten came up with this book, Project to Product, which really, I think for a lot of us that have been thinking about this for a long time, just kind of codified this sort of thinking. And just there's that quote from Mick on there that really talks about how nobody is safe from this. And you really need to be in a position to address this appropriately and take advantage of it, because things are changing. That rate of change is accelerating. And so the whole Agile movement and the whole product or project to product movement, that's about trying to put ourselves in the best possible condition to gain and remain competitive in light of such dramatic changes.
All right. We're going to talk about some of the benefits of becoming a product organization. We'll do a little tee up here and then we'll dig into the details. First off, project organizations tend to be highly focused on what are the activities going on in the environment, and that tends to be highly project focused. What are the projects? What are the specific things we're working on? What's the status of those projects? You know, are we on budget? Are we on time? Are we getting the things done? And product organizations are more focused on what is the real value and what are we really trying to accomplish? And how do we look at things from a more holistic perspective in terms of ultimately impact on the customer and the real business outcomes that we want to deliver on. So we're going to dig into the details behind this as we go through the journey here. The first benefit of becoming a product organization is really improved focus on value delivery. And what does that mean? Most organizations that we work with, one of the most common initial challenges that we have to solve is that there is a lack of alignment around what is value. You have people working in different parts of the organization on different systems. They might look at partners, you know, across the floor or on a different floor. And remember when we had floors and we worked on floors? And they have no idea why somebody else or some other team is working on what they're working on. And that lack of alignment really is one of the chief challenges, that we can't really focus on value because we all have a different definition of what value actually is. Another major challenge that we face is legacy org structures. So if we think about technology, and especially if you're working in a larger organization that's been around for a number of years, the majority of IT organizations were really built around the concept that IT is a cost, and we want to try to manage and mitigate for cost optimization. When you optimize your organization around a paradigm that is focused on cost optimization, I think a lot of you probably understand what pain points result from that. And that's something that we'll dig into a little bit here as we go as well. A third challenge that is similarly kind of rooted in the legacy, if you will, constructs is just the concept of status reporting, right? The concept that you want your status to be reported as green. And so what does green actually mean? You know, there are governance practices and, you know, executive reviews of project and portfolio status. And the focus, you know, tends to be on, are we on schedule? Are we on budget? Are we delivering all the scope? And, you know, frankly, those are not the questions that we really want leaders to be asking in a product organization. We want to be asking different questions. And so where do we start from a value delivery focus if that's important in enabling, you know, becoming a product organization? The first thing is defining and attributing value collaboratively. And you can't define value if you don't understand who your customers are. And one of the patterns that we see a lot when we talk about customer centricity and being focused on the customer, I know I've worked with a lot of really large organizations where we start digging in, okay, who are our customers? And we do a brainstorming exercise, and like 70% of the answers that show up around who are our customers are other groups within IT. And it's sort of a, like, you know, head smacking moment that those are not your customers. Those are your collaborators. Those are your partners. And even more than that, pointing to the business, like the business is your customer internally, but if you're treating your business partners not as partners and as customers, that's part of the challenge as well. Once you have clarity on who your customers are, get all the right people at the table, get the stakeholders, across the business who impact those customers directly and are focused on delivering value and addressing the needs of those customers, and really think through what are the components of value, what are the things that we should be focused on, and then assess based on all the options you have to work on, how much do each of these options impact the components of value that we've identified, and doing that together, right? One of the patterns that we see a lot is our business partners will define, hey, here's something that we want technology to go deliver on, throw it over the wall, and now we've got technology basically making the call on what value is, where a much better answer would be, why don't we get technology business, and not just the business partner who asked for this, but other business partners who are asking for other things. Let's get them all in the same conversation and align on, here's the things that impact value, and here's how we rate all of the different options, so that we walk out of that conversation really understanding not just the value of the things that one business partner is asking for, but each business partner now has new appreciation and lens on what everyone collectively is asking for. And that clarity, when you think about operational efficiency, the clarity that affords is worth its weight in gold, because now you're not having to answer questions that you're probably having to answer on a continual basis around, why is my thing not getting done? They were in the conversation. They saw where their thing stacked up against everything else. So in order to do that, the second thing we have on the slide is defining your products. And what we mean by that is you start with your customer, but understanding what are the things that we deliver that address the needs and the wants and the desires of a unique customer type that we have. And let's focus on how do we deliver, a specific thing, a solution that addresses the need of a given customer type, and have that be the predominant focus over a technology stack, or an individual application, perhaps. And optimizing end to end to focus on how do we deliver a product-centric solution to the market across all of the different structures that we have in place today. So we want to up-level the things that we're focusing on, rather than focusing on individual work efforts, stories, if you will, at a team level, at a specific component level, and measuring, at a more detailed level like that. Let's look at what are the real value containers, and how long does it take us? Where do we have handoffs? Where do we have inefficiencies? And how do we shift the way that we're delivering from an end-to-end perspective? There's a lot within that. One of the big things that will enable you to optimize end-to-end is to look at who are the leaders from an org structure perspective, and what are they all incented on? Because I can tell you, one of the patterns we see a lot is you've got a VP who's very clear on what their goals are, and they are unfortunately highly incented in many cases to deliver on their goals, often at the cost of an improved end-to-end overall delivery. So how do we get more shared goals so that we can have the right behaviors and start to break down those silos? All right, so a little bit of a tease on this one from the last points, but the second large benefit of becoming a product organization is, as I was talking about, simplified execution. and what does that look like in terms of, challenge? I refer to the business as a customer rather than a partner. How are you working with the business? Making sure that there are collaborative conversations going on, that you don't, take the stance that the business just articulates their asks, puts it in your queue, and you work on it, and give them a call when it's done. But having more engagement throughout the entire end-to-end cycle. Funding governance is a big one, and I would anticipate we'll have Q&A questions around this, so feel free to leverage that Q&A button. The way funding happens often drives a lot of the behaviors, right? Well, we have to have, project budget in order to be able to open recs, to be able to fill positions for people who are going to go work on this thing. And that entire process really sort of keeps you stuck where you are today. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. And then the third item that is a challenge to simplified execution is legacy roles and responsibilities. And what I mean by that is, how many layers of people do you have that a big part of their job is aggregating status? I've worked with organizations that literally have 3 layers of people who take status from the layer below them, aggregate it, and roll it up to the next layer. That is extremely wasteful, and it's reinforced by the legacy org structures and the accountabilities in that model that's established. All right. So where do we start? So we talked about treating the business as more of a partner, less of a customer. And we want to take that conversation around how do we evolve the ways that we're working and define that together. So if you sit within the technology part of your organization, I have a pretty strong opinion that probably the worst thing you can do is try to define what you think is the optimal answer and then go communicate it to the business. What I have found to be a much more effective approach is engage the business early. One of the taglines that I use is, you want to do this with the business, not to the business. So that means going to them with an idea around, hey, here's what we're trying to accomplish. Here's what we see as a challenge. Here's what we want to address. Here's the improved outcome that we want to be able to get together. Let's talk through it. Let's see what's possible. Most business organizations aren't, staffed out of the gate to be able to plug people into product owner and product manager roles. A lot of the business operations in the business side, they're already running pretty lean, and now you're asking them to engage more fully. It's going to take them some time, but defining together, what's the path forward is absolutely the most impactful way to get to where you're trying to go. I'm going to skip the second bullet and come back to it. The third bullet here, redefine roles collaboratively. That ties into the first point from the business partnership perspective. It also ties into your current org structure and what are the roles and responsibilities. The most common conversation that we see is, okay, in our existing structure, we have managers. Work goes to managers. Managers allocate who's going to work on what. They essentially manage the priorities of their team. Are we getting rid of managers? And for me, the conversation always starts with, well, what is the real value you want out of somebody in that role? There's a very effective workshop technique that we use where we'll get managers in a room and we'll create an inventory of, well, what are all the things that you do? Kind of break down, what are the activities that you do? You have things like coaching and mentoring their direct reports, being forward thinking about technology, like building out reusable patterns, all kinds of things. But then on the other side of that is managing the work and managing the priorities and providing status. And then in that workshop, we asked them, okay, out of all the things that you just identify the things that you would like to do more of and the things that you would like to do less of. And certainly in my experience, it's been probably a 95+% hit rate that if we look at what the managers would prefer to do more of and less of, that's exactly what aligns with what an effective product organization would look like. We want managers to be leaders and developers of their team and less focused on, actually doing the work and managing the work. So back to the second bullet, re-architecting funding models and reporting. This is one of the biggest enablers, if you will. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the opportunities here and tell a story about a client that I worked with where they did an assessment of their portfolio and the impact of converting from project orientation to a product orientation. So as part of that, they defined what their products were. They did a mapping of their existing projects into these new product buckets in terms of their internal systems that they use to track progress, monitor funding. And they basically found a 90% reduction in simply the number of buckets that they're measuring and monitoring. And then they did an analysis of how much did that save in management overhead, right? Where when they had almost 10x the number of buckets, what activities went into starting up a project in the system? What activities went into shutting down, closing out a project? What were the monthly activities that had to happen in terms of ongoing management and reporting of the project status, the funding, what's the burn? Are we behind on our burn, ahead on our burn, all of those activities? And they found that for the aggregate spend of their entire organization, that simple reduction of reporting against products and getting rid of 90% of the buckets that previously had been projects, it was close to a 10% net impact in terms of the overall budget and funding of that organization. So imagine if you had 10% more budget to spend on tooling, to spend on test automation, to spend on hiring more engineering horsepower. The simple impact that you can have just by that simplification of what you're tracking is massive. And so with that, we're gonna move into the third benefit, and Mark's gonna talk us through that one.
So thanks, Randy. Great explanation of those things. So what I'm going to talk about is gaining some improved insight and control of the flow of work that goes through your product development process. And this is really kind of a key starting point and maybe one of the easier places that you can start. However, there are some pretty significant challenge that can come in here. And some of what I'm going to tell you guys is a little bit repetitive to what Randy says, but I chose to repeat it because it is so critical to this process. And that is making sure that customer value goes from this vague abstraction where if you ask 10 people, you're going to get 10 variations, and go through the process of eliminating the assumptions around that and make sure that everybody knows what that is. Some of the other big challenges here, and I'm going to talk about this, I'll just preface it with that I have been and led PMOs that are on both sides of what I'm about to explain. So please don't take offense if you live in a PMO right now. But the status quo is really something that's a challenge that's got to be overcome. And frequently the PMO, as kind of the owner of processes and controls and things like that, they become the defenders of that status quo rather than enablers. So you end up with both the PMO having the perception that they lose control. And if we go back to Randy's VP, that person's also feels like they're losing control. And then the other part of the status quo is that we're asking people to change the way they're looking at things, where looking at milestones is not the important part. The equation shifts to, are we creating value? Are we doing things like that? So there's a lot of things around that status quo that's going to require some pretty serious work to overcome. Education is one of the other things that needs to be addressed. We don't all speak the same language. And I don't mean that on our team we have people who speak Mandarin, German, and English. What I mean is that we don't have the same business language. So we're not using the same currency when we talk about things. And so a lot of what we'll get into is some of these other slides of basic lean concepts, lean metrics that can be used universally, whether we're talking about product development or some other process inside your company, that will then allow everyone to, when you say, what's the cycle time on that? Everybody knows exactly what you mean. And then limiting work is one of the most universal problems that any company has. All people, almost every company, I can't ever say I've been in one that has too little work. There is almost always a massive difference between what your company's capacity is and what the demand for that work to do is. And frequently, companies don't even know what their capacity actually is. So not having tight control over your input, not being able to see where your bottlenecks are, those are pretty significant challenges in terms of making a switch to this. But if we want to take a little bit more positive outlook on this, we'll talk about where to start, because there are definitely some things that you can get going that's relatively easy. Is define that customer value. Have discussions with your business partners or business, technology, support, operations, finance, and have those discussions around what are our products, how do our products create customer value, and make sure that everybody knows about it. And I don't just mean a delivery team, I mean everybody in the company. Make sure that they are clear about what your products are. And when you go through and define products, it's a hard thing. There's no specific formula to do it. And so you are likely to, it's the kind of thing where you could debate for weeks and never come to an answer that you really like. So I would encourage you all, as you go through this process, to make the assumption that you're not going to get it exactly right the first time, but that you should pick a good enough starting point and just start, and then learn to iterate through it. And then that second point, measure what matters. We don't necessarily care about how many user stories get completed. Those don't necessarily help us, but we do want to look at things like lead time, cycle time, work in progress. Those things matter because they're what help us understand how we can better deliver value, or how much value we're delivering to our customers, as well as starting to identify bottlenecks in the processes and the value stream that we use to create that value. And then one of the things that we want to start doing as well is to start measuring outputs. And we'll talk pretty specifically about how to measure those outputs, as we want to know not what's in progress. Well, we do want to know what's in progress, but we want to understand what the system is actually managing to churn out and put in the hands of customers or not put in the hands of customers. So we want to shift from that idea of measuring what's going on inside the process to what's coming out of the process, the results that we get. And part of the way we can do that is through a concept called flow distribution. This is something that Mick Kirsten really comes through in the book, and we'll go through in a little more detail here in a second. But the idea being that you designate every work item that flows through into one of a number of categories, and then you use that to help you understand. You use the lean metrics that I talked about to understand how efficient your processes are and what the capacity of your processes are, and you use flow distribution to understand what that system is actually producing. And then you can set up a target flow distribution for those things, and you can compare what you wanted to do compared to what you actually did. And this is a surprisingly simple thing to do, and I'll tell you a little story about doing it in Jira. But some of the things that we go through this is this really, if you start to set flow distribution targets, it really helps drive sound engineering practices. It can help you understand where your architecture is being neglected. It will help improve your quality. And then as you set these targets, they can change over time. It's not that you say, hey, we're going to divide things up and everybody gets a quarter of this, off we go. You're going to have changing business conditions, which will mean that you want to change what your targets are in terms of flow distribution. And then one real key thing with flow distribution is to make sure that every work item gets a designation into one of these categories, because if you don't, your data is only as good as the way it manages. And so the quick story I'll tell you about this, if you guys are Jira users, this is relatively easy to do. Is we went through this once, and we basically said every trying to think of the right issue, every issue type that got closed, before it could be closed, it had to have a designation into one of these flow categories. And then what we did, so that we didn't have that work on the back end, is we actually put it in at the feature level, and so that whoever was creating the feature would have to choose which flow category it fit into, and then all of the issues that were created as children of that feature inherited its parents' flow category, with still the option to change it, because it's not always a one-to-one issue. But that, we built it into the work, and we immediately began to start to measure. Really, honestly, within days, we started to be able to understand what our system was actually producing. All right, we're going to get a little bit into this. So this is the flow framework. If you've read Mick's book, you're definitely familiar with this, because it's a big part of it. We could go very deep on this, but for the purposes of this, I've chosen just to focus kind of on the flow metrics, and what I just covered with kind of talking about the lean metrics. That's what is up there with flow velocity. That's just how many things are coming out of your system over a given period of time. Your flow efficiency is just the difference between lead time and cycle time, as in how much time is something waiting versus being worked on once it's in progress. Flow time is the same as cycle time, if you're familiar with that. And then flow load, that's just the number of items that you have in your system that are in one form of progress or another. So I'm not going to go too much deeper into that, but when I talked about the flow categories, that's what we've got here between features, defects, risks, and debts. So features are, everybody's familiar with features because we all love to build new cool stuff, and most businesses almost fall into a little bit of a trap around building features and neglecting the other three categories. And I think one of the things that this flow framework does is it makes these other three categories first-class citizens in terms of how you plan your work. So we're all familiar with defects, and this is just something that's a problem. Some part of the system is misbehaving and it's impacting customers. We definitely want to address those. Risks are a different thing, and I have a lot of experience in banks, so I'm very familiar with this sort of work being introduced along the way, whether it was an audit that was completed or something like that. This stuff needs to come into the system. It needs to be dealt with, and it needs to be planned and thought of in the same light as new features. And then debts, we all hear about technical debt as well. It's probably, of all these things, the one that tends to get neglected the most. But I think one of the things that the flow framework calls out is the idea down there, kind of that second bullet under debts, is that the only technical debt work that should be prioritized is that which increases future flows. In other words, this is what you want to do to make it so that you can build more and do it faster in the future. So debts are certainly an investment in your value stream's ability to produce customer value. And this is generally pulled by the architecture team in whatever organization that you've got, the way you've got your products aligned. And then we're just going to go into a quick note on flow distribution. So this is the kind of thing where you can look at it and say, what are we actually building? And back to that point about measure outputs, not inputs. This is all completed work. This isn't work in the system. This is what we actually did. And so you can see that these things change over time. And you can see what happens, that if we spend a lot of time there in month 2 building new features, that the other 3 categories are probably going to rise. There's going to be a correlation to building a lot of features. We know that defects are going to follow a lot of new features, and you can see that in the expansion of that defect work being completed in months 5, 6, and 7. So this is the kind of thing that you can, as a product organization, make very specific business decisions around. For example, if you want to introduce a new product, chances are pretty good that you are going to have a disproportionate portion of your output allocated to new features. Something that you may also have a thing like, if you decide that you want to be ISO 27001 certified, there's probably going to be a higher level of risk work that needs to be addressed in there. So this is a way that you can both visualize and manage what your system is actually producing. And then we're going to cover the last kind of, and this is something you don't have to do exactly anything other than the previous 3 things, is you're going to get an employee base who is more engaged because they begin to better understand how they're producing value for the company. They have influence over it, and they can see the results that they're producing. All right, and with that, we are going to go into a short Q&A session based on the questions that you guys have posted. So if you have any outstanding questions, now would be a fantastic time to post those, because Randy and I are going to spend a few minutes in here. Randy, are there any of these that jump out at you that you want to?
Yeah, I'd like to take one of the questions. So the question reads, in my experience, in most organizations, transformation doesn't start from the CEO. Funding can't be changed by IT or any one department for that matter, especially when the board promises to Wall Street 25% spend every quarter. So where does transformation really start? That's a fantastic question, and I really love the opportunity to dig into this one just a little bit. So when I talk about changing funding models, I'm really not talking about that sort of top line, what percent of money are we going to spend on technology related things, or that top level allocation of where dollars go, other than maybe one call out, which is around what are the sort of expected or acceptable practices and sort of the guidelines around things like governing, for example, can you spend money to hire people, or do you need to hire external partners and outsource work? That is one higher level decision that I would say when we talk about re-architecting funding models, that is a principal thing. A lot of companies are very comfortable and think they're really mitigating for risk overall by having a high variable pool of money that gets used to hire external consultants. And what happens is, even though I've worked in organizations where there's been a consultant that works for another company that's where they get their paycheck from, but they've been working with that same client for 8 years. I've also, experienced the flip side of that, where you've got partners that have, turnover every 6 months on average in some areas. Both of those scenarios are painful. And so if we want to be more effective overall, we need the ability to build internal competency and build high performing teams towards this end. So that's one kind of higher level aspect of funding. What I was really getting to, though, when we talk about re-architecting the funding models, is with that big bucket of money, what are the rules that govern how we're able to spend that money? And one organization that I worked with years ago said, we really need to solve this, because what ends up happening is, as leaders, if we're not continually focused on what projects are ramping down and what projects are ramping up, like they would literally at least once a year in different parts of the organization, they would have a oops, I took my eye off the ball for just a second, and now I've got 4 big projects ramping down. I don't have the project pipeline filled with things that are going to get through the stage gates to get approved, so that the people working on these 4 projects can seamlessly transition to these new projects. Like that, the overhead and the complexity and the risk in that is just tremendous. And this was a really big, really well-known organization, and they said, if we get nothing else out of this whole effort that we're working to improve and change the ways we're working, then to stop doing that, everything else will have been totally worth it. So being able to fund bigger blocks, right? Fund your products, enable longer-lived teams of teams that are aligned with a product, being able to manage within that, what are all the things coming into the funnel for this product based on how we have defined value, understanding what are the most valuable things to do. One of the practices around this that we didn't even touch on in here, but getting into lean portfolio practices, where there's a really well-respected colleague in this space who's been tweeting lately about the idea that epics should never be completed. And it's like, yeah, there's some truth to that, but how do we transition from our old way of thinking of, here's this thing that we need, and here's 100 requirements, and it's done when the 100th requirement is part of the solution, and we can say it's complete, to continually looking at how do we do the most valuable? Like maybe once we get to 70, 80, 85% complete, we've exhausted the most value from that. And now when we look at the other things in our funnel, we say, you know what? We're 80%, we're not going to do the last 20%, or we're not going to do it now, because that will enable us to start on this higher value thing sooner, and being able to get those practices in place. So those would be some of the things that I would consider in answering that question. All right.
Yeah, I'll probably add a little bit to that. We talk about where this, and there's another question in here about who would lead this transformation. So I think one place where the transformation might start with just one very specific action is to define a product. And so if you can start with defining a product, that will give you the ability to start talking about that and building alliances around the idea of, we have a product and we need to treat it as such. And so to so both in terms of the question that Randy just answered and who's going to lead the transformation, my experience has said that it works pretty well if you can get somebody on the product side, however that may be represented, a relatively senior person on the product side of your company and a relatively senior person on the engineering side of your company, and just have them start talking, have them have that product discussion, have them do the product definition and talk about what it needs, what you would need in order to support something as a product. And then you can build that out further. If you've got some sort of service organization that supports that product, bring them into the conversation. If you have a finance partner, bring them into the conversation. If you have compliance and risk people, so you can just progressively add people. And then what tends to happen is as that particular new product begins to have focus and greater success, other people want to have a little taste of that, and they want to know how you did it.
Nice.
So I'm going to read this whole question just to make sure we address everything. Just who do you see leading this transformation? Product managers who want to venture into managing the complexity of a dev pipeline, or project managers that could merge into a product-based value proposition? So I think the answer to that is yes. Because this kind of manifests itself in a bunch of different ways, depending on how you do that product definition, and then how you identify everybody who participates in the creation of value for that product. So can project managers have a big part in this? Yeah, absolutely. Project managers can be huge enablers of this. Because they tend to have great organizational skills. They might be really good facilitators. Frequently, they are incredibly stubborn and unwilling to let things go. So that could be a great pathway for a project manager to carve out a new value proposition for the PMO.
Awesome. Thanks, Mark. I'd like to take the mindset question, if that's okay. The question is, what are some of the hardest mindset or behavior shifts when orgs shift to a product model? There are certainly several, but one of the top of mind, for me that I see repeatedly in all the organizations I've worked with is the belief that whatever we decide to do is based on, a fairly high level of certainty, and that whatever process or business case is presented in order to get something approved, that answer is good, it's done, right? Like, we're not going to question it anymore. And so I'll tell a quick story around how that mindset shows up. I worked with an organization where, and stop me if you've heard this one before, because every time I tell it, I get lots of head nods, where they had a rock solid business case around a new market opportunity. They had a certain type of customer that had a certain type of need. The business case proved out that if we go build this thing and we get it launched by the end of Q2, that we will get $5 million in new sales by the end of the fiscal year. So everybody's like really excited. Hey, like, this is great. Like, 5 million in new sales, just in the last half of the year from this one thing. So there was a tremendous focus to go get this thing built. Their entire focus was getting the thing built because the business case was rock solid. It was true, right? So they built the thing, they launched the thing, and over the subsequent 6 months, they got exactly $0 in new sales from that thing. And so the conversation I had with them at that point was, okay, how do we take and look at our investments, not based on what came out on the right-hand side of the equal sign in our value calculation or our ROI, but how do we continually focus on what were the variables in that equation, and what were the assumptions? Where do we have assumptions? And so product model a big enabler and a big success factor of the product model is letting go of your certainty bias that, you have defined this thing and you just need to go build it. Let's focus on schedule and scope and budget, right? Instead, let's focus on assumptions and is this thing really solving what we think it's going to solve? And the customers that we're trying to deliver value to, what do they think about this? And how do we more quickly kill or cut off investments when we know that those assumptions aren't true? So that to me is one of the biggest mindset or behavior shifts that I see around that. Like I said, among others. Mark, anything you would add on that one?
I would tend to agree with you on that. Is, everybody falls in love with their idea. A project funding model, though, is flawed because it does, it explicitly accepts the business case to be true when it is at best speculation. So it is a very hard thing for, we'll just say, idea generators in general to have to really prove out and be willing to discard ideas that aren't functioning. And then I think the other mindset shift that's very tough, but this helps when you bring the technical staff to the table in terms of considering what you're going to do, is the idea that things like debts are first-class citizens, that they have to be treated in exactly the same way as do new features. It's a big deal, and I know we've got some people on here from pretty highly regulated industries. So same thing with compliance and risk and security. Those things, they float right to the surface, and that can be a very tough gig for Randy's hypothetical VP, who's used to getting his or her way every time.
All right, I know we need to get moving. I'm gonna suggest we go ahead and move out of Q&A mode. All right, so again, summarizing project to product, it's really focusing on the big thing, like what is customer value? How are we delivering customer value? Like looking end to end and making sure we're optimizing for end-to-end performance. And making sure that we've got a more solid partnership and connection between IT and the business as collaborators and co-creators. Where to start? We kind of pulled off a couple of the more important, more easy, potentially easier things to start with here from the items we covered above. But you absolutely need to understand who your customers are, what value is in relation to satisfying their needs, and then defining across your technology landscape, what are the things that together make up a product that serve your different types of customers. Work through, defining the shifts to how you're going to work collaboratively, both with business partners as well as your internal people who have roles that are going to potentially be shifting. The funding models and reporting, right? Like we want to shift from, is it on time? Is it on budget? Are we delivering all the scope? To what's the value? Do we have an established way of looking at value? And that shows up in the model that Mark walked us through, right? Around measuring the flow distribution, right? And if nothing else, being able to characterize your work in those 4 categories and see where you're spending your time and what you're actually delivering. We want to stop taking credit for and measuring how many things are active. We want to start measuring how many things are getting done. And that's a big part of that part of the model. Mark, anything you'd add to this slide?
Got to unmute. No, I think you got it pretty good.
All right.
The one thing I would add is get started by doing something. Take any of those and start.
Exactly. So a little bit about us. Agile Velocity is 100% focused on getting outcomes, getting clarity. You know, companies come to us like, hey, we want to do this, we want to do that, we want to do something different. You know, that's what transformation is all about. We were doing one thing, we want to do a new thing. Why do you want to do that? If you're doing this new thing and it's working, how will you know? What's important to you? And we've got a model for engaging, driving that alignment, working through that, helping you get to those improved outcomes. And our focus, you know, is as an enabler and a partner. You know, for us, we're successful when we can walk away and you're able to sustain the changes that we've worked through together. So that is really who we are and what's important to us and what the value that we bring and the engagements that we partner with customers on. That proven model that we use is the Path to Agility framework that, you know, leads through a series of stages, making sure that we've got all of the things in place. You know, it's not just about doing things right at the team level. It's not just about doing things right at the portfolio level. It's doing things right at all levels, including, you know, senior most leadership. So everyone in the organization has changes that they need to make. You know, if you're only making changes in one area or another, you'll get benefits, sure, but the ceiling on what's possible is much higher when you know, really look more holistically, and that's what Path to Agility is all about. Path to Agility is you know, a framework agnostic in terms of, you know, are you a Kanban organization? Are you a Scrum organization? Are you a SAFe organization? Are you a LESS organization? We don't care. The framework will ask all the important questions and make sure that, you know, where you have gaps, you're able to see those gaps and be able to address them. And lastly, these are the business outcomes from Path to Agility. This is always one of the most impactful things, where we start with very senior level conversations around, hey, are you all aligned on what's important? And we typically hear, yes, we're absolutely aligned. And then we go through a workshop and we find that across the leadership team, 6 of these 9 things are the most important. And it's like, it doesn't feel like you're totally aligned. So why don't we talk about that? And driving that alignment really helps get the right buy-in and support and push to help support the things that everyone's trying to do. So with that, that's a wrap. Feel free to email myself or Mark directly, or you can email our info@Agile Velocity mailbox if you feel like it's more of a general question. We're here to continue the dialogue and would welcome the opportunity.